Welcome back. I'm now joined by a well-known whistleblower who broke rank with his ANC colleagues in the early days of the arms deal, Mr. Andrew Feinstein, who has taken the experience and lesson learned globally. Andrew steadfastly insisted that there was something wrong with the notorious arms deal in South Africa, and in recent years he has been exposing corruption between Britain and weapons manufacturers and their role in instigating wars in the Middle East and elsewhere. For instance, we now know that 40% of corruption in the world has got to do with the military industry. Andrew Feinstein has written the book After the Party with referencing the arms deal, and he has also published The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, which has also been turned into a movie. It exposes the shocking truth about the war industry. He joins us now from London. Andrew, pleasure to talk to you and welcome.
Thanks, Tim. Great to talk to you.
Just give me a global view, because you've been monitoring these things around the world. What's happening with the weapons industry and the extent of corruption in that sector globally, that is?
Tim, unfortunately, the story continues to get worse. There are massive increases in defense spending, especially in volatile regions like the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have become the biggest purchasers of weaponry in the world. Those weapons come primarily from the United States, from the United Kingdom, Germany, France, and other European manufacturers. And they're being used in conflicts such as the Yemen conflict, where the UN has reported almost 15,000 innocent civilians have been killed, not as collateral damage, but actually as targeted killings by the Saudi-led coalition. So attacks on residential areas, on places of worship, on schools, on hospitals. And the reason that the Yemen conflict continues unabated over so many years is because so many people are making so much money out of it. So, as you mentioned in your introduction, around 40% of all corruption in all global trade takes place in the arms business. And we're seeing, if anything, that situation is getting worse.
But now, when you go around investigating what's going on within the arms deals of the world, the contracts that get signed, and the role that the agreements play in instigating wars, has this been a dangerous journey for you?
I haven't really been in physical danger. I mean, there've been one or two situations where I've received threats, particularly from arms dealers. But the way in which people try to stop our work is through legal means. So we once had the extraordinary situation where an arms dealer who was actually a fugitive from justice at the time in France tried to sue us for damage to his reputation in the United Kingdom. And it's really just a way of trying to destroy us financially, because, as you can imagine, it's not easy to raise money to do this sort of work. And of course, there are attempts by governments, by weapons makers, and by some of the individuals we write and talk about to stop us publishing or broadcasting about them. So that's the real threat. The physical threats, I should just say, Tim, are really aimed at the sources, at the whistleblowers who provide people like me with information. So, you know, the sort of the Edward Snowdens and the Chelsea Mannings of this world, but those we don't hear about, who are sort of a bit smaller, less conspicuous than people like Snowden.
Now, I've made a point about wars being instigated in order to benefit the weapons manufacturers, the industry, right? And from the readings I've done on your work and other people's work, it seems like governments are acting in cahoots with such weapons manufacturers. So how are the wars instigated? Because, you know, it's a big, broad claim that must be proven in time, that there is a profit motive behind the wars that we see in Yemen, as you've mentioned, and parts of Afghanistan and other parts of the world, even on the African continent.
Absolutely. You know, Tim, we don't argue that economic reasons, corruption, greed, is always the primary cause of war. Obviously, there are often geopolitical factors, there are often local and or regional factors that come into play. But what we argue is that one of the incentives, certainly for the initiation of some conflicts, is economic advantage and material gain, and certainly the continuation and intensification of conflicts is often driven by material gain and economic greed, not just for individuals, but often for political parties or political movements. So a few examples. The template of the modern arms dealer, who I've written a huge amount about, was a guy called Basil Zaharov, often regarded as the godfather of the modern BAE Systems, the company notoriously involved in corruption in the South African arms deal. And Zaharov was actually an advisor to the British Prime Minister Lloyd George at the height of his career. And he was Lloyd George's envoy to the Paris peace talks. And what he did at the Paris peace talks was attempt to scupper any sort of movement towards peace, because his empire required the continuation of the battle of the First World War. Let's take that many, many decades later and look at the situation of the invasion of Iraq, where Dick Cheney, who we should remember effectively appointed himself vice president of America under George W. Bush, he headed the committee to look for the vice president and came back with the conclusion that he was the best person for the job.
Yeah.
He had been chief executive of a big defense company. And he then moved from that company into the vice presidency, where he was the main cheerleader for the invasion of Iraq. His former company made $38 billion from the invasion of Iraq. We estimate that Cheney personally made somewhere between $60 and $100 million personally out of that invasion. And so with virtually every major conflict, we can identify key decision makers towards the conflict who have benefited financially, personally.
But now, Andrew, this may be hard to understand when you think of the role of the so-called first world, the civilized world. And I'm asking this question against the backdrop of what transpired at NATO this past week, right? With the discussions around peace and contribution to military exercises and so forth of the member countries of NATO. Now, with the ability of forming those types of alliances, one would have thought that wars can be averted. And you have mentioned some of the NATO members as the weapons producing countries with an interest in the wars that are taking place elsewhere. Why is the experience that they have within NATO, for instance, not being used to promote peace in those countries that have conflict?
Well, I think the first point is, Tim, that some people, I mean, there are varying views on NATO. So some would argue that it has been absolutely crucial to peace. Some would argue that what it's actually been doing is, since the end of the Cold War, is ramping up tensions with Russia, and that has probably made conflict in places like the Ukraine and others more likely. So there are diverse views on NATO. But there is no doubt in my mind, for instance, that the European Union and NATO, on balance, have actually contributed more to peace than to war. But they've done so, even their contributions to peace are done in a way that makes it incredibly lucrative for weapons makers. So after the Cold War, when NATO was expanding to the countries of Eastern Europe that were under the former Soviet Union's influence, I have recorded in my work very senior members of American arms companies who were employed by the American government. So one gentleman who was a very senior executive at Lockheed Martin, the world's biggest weapons maker, was made chair of a committee called the Committee to Expand NATO, and he would travel around these Eastern European countries like Poland and Hungary and others, and he would say to them, "We will support your membership of NATO on condition that you modernize your armed forces exclusively with our products from Lockheed Martin." So in that case, Lockheed Martin made around $18 billion on Poland's accession to NATO, which the senior executive at Lockheed Martin, on behalf of the American government, had effectively paved the way for. So even when it's a process of peacemaking, There are huge amounts of monies involved. And now we have Donald Trump, who of course has just recently massively increased the US defense budget to well over $700 billion a year. Trump has been demanding that countries of NATO increase their defense spending to 4% of GDP, which frankly, on any sort of neutral, independent analysis of the sorts of problems facing these countries, is a complete absurdity in terms of the amount of resource that should be going towards defense. So even in the peacemaking process, Tim, there is a huge economic incentive.
But now, what I'm grappling with, battling with and trying to work my mind around is that, is this deliberate, or are the leaders of the countries that produce weapons doing what they're doing unwittingly? Or, what are the considerations that are motivating their behavior? The growth of their economies,
Sure,
or the intention to just stoke fires around the world?
I think in most instances it's probably relatively unwitting. In some instances, like the Cheney example that I give, or in the case of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia now, I think it is very targeted and very clear as to what the intentions are. So Saudi Arabia, for instance, uses these massive arms deals to effectively move money from the state treasury in Saudi Arabia into the private offshore accounts of senior members of the royal family, to the tune of billions and billions of dollars. So I think for Saudi to be stoking conflicts like the Yemen conflict is entirely witting. I don't think it's unwitting at all. But in the case of, for instance, some European leaders, first of all, there is a political dividend for them. So they need to stand up in front of their people and say, in the face of numerous threats, I am the person who is going to keep you safe, who is going to defend you. And the easiest way to say that they are fulfilling that promise is to spend more on defense and national security, even if that expenditure actually makes them less rather than more safe, for instance, by spending billions of dollars on inappropriate equipment that they actually don't need, but which a company is selling to them. So there is that political dimension. The other political dimension is obviously economic. Now, there is a claim from some that weapons making is an absolutely crucial part of their economy. So the United Kingdom government claims that regularly. In fact, weapons account for less than 2% of Britain's total exports to the world, and it accounts for less than 1% of GDP in the United Kingdom. But the amount of support given and subsidy given to the British arms trade is hugely in excess of its actual economic power, in addition to which a number of studies which I collate and put together in The Shadow World and in a more recent book called Indefensible, 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade. A number of economists around the world have shown that for the public investment in every job in the defense sector, you could be creating 3 to 7 equivalent jobs in more socially and economically productive sectors.
Well, Andrew,
so the economic arguments are really, really poor as well.
Let's look at those 7 myths in a moment, as well as other related issues around our discussion this evening. And I'm talking to Andrew Feinstein, South African based in the UK. He's been exposing corruption in the weapons industry around the globe. And we will continue our chat in a moment. You can also participate in this conversation on Twitter, #TheModise Network. We'll be back in a moment.